Erev Tov, everyone from Jerusalem. I'm Leon Morris, the president of the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies. I'm also an alumnus of Pardes, where I studied 25 years ago. Thank you for joining us for this opening lecture of the Brettler lecture series, which was established in memory of Sidney and Miriam Brettler, Zichronam Livracha. We have a global audience, and many of you joining are not entirely familiar with the mission and vision of Pardes. Pardes believes that everyone should have equal access to an immersive text-based Jewish education, and that deep Jewish learning is the inheritance of every single Jew. At Pardes, we celebrate the diversity of Jewish life, and we believe that Jewish learning can provide a common language of understanding and discourse and meaning. Pardes has both long-term and short-term programs and classes here in Israel, in North America, and online. And I'm really delighted to welcome you here. I'm particularly excited because Rabbi Dr. Dalia Marx is a dear friend and a cherished colleague. I want to invite you throughout the lecture to pose a question in the chat, and the questions will be addressed at the end of the lecture as time allows. I want to particularly thank the Brettler family and acknowledge their presence tonight. Mark, Dina, and Ellie, what an honor you've given to your parents' memory. On behalf of Pardes, I want to thank you for magnifying both the memory of your parents and magnifying the Torah on their behalf and on ours. Yagdil Torah v'Yadir. I want to call upon Professor Mark Brettler to introduce this evening's program and our featured speaker.
Thank you very much. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to this year's Sidney and Miriam Brettler Memorial Lecture Series, and to have in this Zoom audience all of you, and especially my brother Elias, my sister Dina, other relatives, and several friends of my parents. The three of us thank Pardes for enabling us to honor our parents through this series. Our parents, Sidney and Miriam Brettler, were the children of immigrants who arrived in the United States as part of the great early 20th century migration from Eastern Europe. They grew up in very Jewishly oriented homes. My father, Sidney, attended an afternoon cheder. He actually paid attention, and decades later was proud of his ability to help me with my yeshiva Flatbush Gemara homework. My father was intensely interested in Jewish history and culture, manifested in his large book collection, some of which is now housed in the Pardes Library. After making Aliyah, Pardes was an important home for slaking his thirst for Jewish learning, and he was happy to count Rabbi Danny Landis, Cheryl Robbins, and Alex Israel among his friends. My mother was a much beloved kindergarten teacher at PS 180 in Borough Park, where I grew up, before it was the Borough Park as we now know it. Her reputation as a teacher was such that some of the Orthodox families sent their daughters to my mother's class, where they could be certain that they would be treated with respect and that the pretzels served at snack time would be kosher. My mother, who had studied Hebrew at Thomas Jefferson High School in Brooklyn, and could be convinced to sing one of the school songs, B'Veit Sifrenu b'Thomas Jefferson, Anu Lomdim Ivrit, Menahalenu hu Dr. Lieberman, and so forth. She was my first Hebrew teacher. Attention spans these days, especially on Zoom, are brief. So my introduction for Rabbi Dr. Marx will be brief. Dalia Marx is the Rabbi Aaron D. Pankin Professor of Liturgy and Midrash at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Jerusalem. Ordained by HUC and with a PhD from the Hebrew University, she is a 10th generation Jerusalemite on her mother's side. Her books on different aspects of liturgy and the liturgical year are one about transition times in liturgy, Be'et Zishan Ve'a'ira, al tefilot sheben yom uven laila. Another about the entire liturgical calendar, Bazman, Masaot Beluach Hashanah Hayudi Yisraeli. She has co-authored a prayer book, Sidur Tefilat Ha'adam, and has written a volume in a feminist commentary on the Talmud. She has also co-authored a Haggadah for our time. But she has done much more than write books. She's a significant public intellectual who has written over 250 scholarly and popular articles. And this is if we count her over 500 contributions to the Israeli Bible 929 project as one single article. And many of her articles are fun to read and of significant contemporary relevance. I will mention only one here, since it reminds me of one of the many bad jokes my father used to tell about the Reformed Jewish American who was on his first trip to Jerusalem and went to the Reformed synagogue in Jerusalem on Shabbat, and then complained that the services were in Hebrew, so he could not understand a word. Rabbi Dr. Marx has written an article that I'm sure our father would have enjoyed called When Lashon HaKodesh is Also the Vernacular, the Development of Israeli Reform Liturgy. She has also written one of my favorite articles for the Torah.com for Yom HaAtzmaut several years ago on the biblical sources and successive revisions of HaTikvah. As you'll soon hear, she's also a remarkable teacher. One of her former students, whom I know, described her as both incredibly knowledgeable and maintaining a perpetual sense of curiosity and openness about liturgy, thus allowing room for both liturgical traditionalists, and these are my friend's words, and the hippy-dippy types. My friend told me that a traditionalist father of a friend of hers heard Rabbi Dr. Marx on the radio and was so impressed with her that he stopped opposing the whole Hebrew Union College enterprise, which he had until then thought was pointless. Tonight, we'll have the pleasure of hearing her begin her three-part lecture series, Women's Prayers and Women Pray-ers, From Hannah to Today. Today's lecture is titled, From the Bible to the Talmud. Rabbi Dr. Marx.
Toda Rabba, Professor Mark, for this way too generous introduction. I'm very, very honored and moved to be here with you today in the opening of the Sidney and Miriam Brettler Memorial Lecture Series. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Dina. Mark is a colleague. Dina is a co-worshipper. We daven together. And thank you, Elias, for your trust. Thank you, Mechon Pardes, Rabbi Leon Morris, and Alex Israel, and all the good people of Pardes. And I'm really opening this series with a sense of the psalmist, what he called Vegilu Bereada, rejoice while trembling. As you can probably hear, my English is not a native speaker, kind of English, but I will do my best. I think the topic that we chose for this series is important and interesting beyond the academic scope of it, because it really may help us to shape our understanding of what it means to be a Jewish woman and to be a Jewish religious woman today. What can we learn from our ancestors? And I can tell you right away, most of what we can learn is not documented. So it is our task to sort of pull some strings and try to make a thread or a cloth of all of them together. Let me upload my PowerPoint. So Jewish women's prayer and Jewish women prayers in antiquity. Today we're gonna have 3 chapters, Bible, Second Temple, and Talmud. I don't know if we will get to the Talmud today, but if we don't, we still have next week. But first of all, when we talk about women and prayer, what actually are we talking about? We're talking about more than one thing. We're talking about women as prayers, as we just said. we're talking about prayers composed by women, and sometimes prayers that are composed for women. And it's interesting to see what those who composed the prayers for women thought should be women's prayer. We can talk about prayers mentioning women, and we can talk about what, you know, this, what can we so-called called feminine prayers, and what does it really mean? So let us start with our journey. First of all, why do we need to talk about women's prayers at all? You know, women compose the 50% of the population, more or less. Why do we need to do that? So let me just mention that named women make up only 5.5 to 8% of all the named characters in the Bible, for example. And in the rabbinic literature, it's even less. So we're gonna really have to look for these voices, for these women voices. And we're gonna do it in a very layered manner. So what can we say about prayers in the Tanakh? First of all, we know that most of the prayers in the Tanakh are spontaneous prayers, event-specific prayers. I'm not talking about the Psalms right now, but we will mention Psalms in a second. Event-specific, someone is in a distress. Jacob is afraid to meet his brother Esau, so he launches, he prays. Yeah, Moses wants to heal his sister, so he prays on her behalf. So these are event-specific, occasional prayers, what we're talking about, and we really don't know much about the prayer of the normal person, of the individual person during the Tanakh period. We only have what we have in the literature. So let's see what we can find of that. First of all, let me ask, when was the first time we humans even prayed? Yeah, and I just want a quick note before we begin. We're gonna have to confine ourselves to talk about women and prayer. There are so many very interesting things that we cannot really go into because they are not in our topic. And even our topic we're gonna have to struggle to make as much as we can in the short time that we have. So we're gonna concentrate on women and prayer. But first of all, what was the first prayer? When people really started to pray? So we see in Genesis 4, the last verse of Genesis 4 says, as for Seth too, to him too was born a son, and he named him Enosh. Yeah, in modern Hebrew, Enosh means human. It was then that man began to invoke the eternal. So you see, I highlighted the word man, because if you look at the Hebrew, it doesn't say man, it says, as huchal likro b'shem Hashem. That is to say, it uses the indifferent voice. It uses the passive voice, which is harder to translate into English. So the translation of the JPS and many others chose to translate it as, it was then that man began. But it's not necessarily man as male, it's people, right? But if I look at the first verse in this chapter, I see something very interesting. So it's not just Shet, who was the son of Adam and Eve, and Enosh was the third generation of humanity. We see a person who invokes the name of God already in the first generation of humanity. And of course, I'm talking about Chava, about Eve. The first verse in this chapter says, now Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I can kaniti ish et Hashem. I have gained, or I have acquired, a man or a male son with the eternal. So in a very simple way, Eve is invoking the name of God. She invokes the name of God even before it was a general thing. Can we consider it a prayer? I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. It's really according to your opinion here. But I would say that at least sometimes when we have midrashim of women who give names to their offsprings and explain the meaning of the name, in some cases it is definitely a prayer. Take, for example, Leah, when she bore her fourth son, and she said, now I'm going to thank the God, thank God, Odeh et Adonai. Yeah, and then she calls him Yehuda, Judah. So maybe that was the first prayer. I don't know. Eve was the first woman on earth. Who was the last major female character in the Hebrew Bible? I would say it was Ruth. And Ruth was a very religious person. She joined Naomi and she said, Elohai, Elohai, your God may be my own God. But there's also another blessing, I would say, that was given to her husband, to Boaz. Oops, that's not what I wanted. Here, that's what I wanted. And this blessing is not a prayer to God, but it is a blessing invoking God's name, and it mentions the name of our ancestors. ייתן השם את האישה הבאה אל ביתך כרחל וכלאה אשר בנו שתיהם את בית ישראל. Yeah, may the Eternal make the woman who comes into your house like Rachel and like Leah, which two did build the house of Israel. Yeah, so remember we said sometimes we want to see if women's names are mentioned in tefillot. So here we have that. I'm going back to my question, what was the first prayer in the history of the world, or as it is depicted in the book of Genesis? Maybe we can even see Hagar as the first worshiper. So Hagar has a revelation of the angel of God twice. Here's the second time, which is also depicted in the High Holiday Liturgy when we read it in the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Now, Hagar is in the wilderness. She was deported to the wilderness. And then it says on verse 16, and she went and sat down at a distance, at a bow shot away, for she thought, let me not look on as the child dies. And sitting thus afar, she lifted her voice and cried. And from this cry, immediately, like a Deus ex machina, God hears this voice and responds. Could it be that her cry encompasses a prayer, a wordless prayer maybe, but nevertheless a very heartfelt prayer? Because we hear Vayishma Elohim et kol hanar, and God hears the cry of the boy, interestingly enough, not the voice of Hagar, but the voice of the boy. And an angel, oh, I can't see that here, sorry. An angel called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heeded the cry of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy, hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him. So whether or not it is a prayer, it is interesting from a phenomenological point of view, because this is not necessarily a verbal prayer, but it is nevertheless a very emotional prayer. I move on to the prayer that we all, and it's also in the title of our series, that we all think about when we think about prayers of women in the Bible, and that's the prayer of Hannah. Now, I debated with myself if we should read the entire text or not. I think we won't, because I think the text is relatively known. Let us just mention that here, let me just upload the text first. Here. So we hear about a woman whose husband is married to two women. One of them has children. One of them, Hannah, does not have children. And she's marat nefesh, and she has a wretchedness of heart. And then she comes to the temple, to the Shiloh temple, to the Shiloh tabernacle, and pray to the God, and she cries, she weeps, and she makes a vow, if God, if you hear my voice, if you hear my prayer, then I will dedicate this son to you. And the interesting thing here is that Eli, the local priest, it says, Ve'eli shomeret piha. Yeah, Eli keeps her mouth. He looks at her, and it seems like he doesn't really know what she's doing, because he thinks that she's drunk. Yeah, she's Hannah. Now Hannah was praying in her heart. Only her lips moved, but her voice could not be heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. And then he rebukes her. He says to her, how long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? And she answers him. This poor woman, with a very bitter heart, she responds and she says, oh, no, my Lord, I'm a very unhappy woman. I have drunk no wine or other strong drink, but I've been pouring my heart to the Lord, to the eternal. Do not take your maidservant for a worthless woman. I've been only speaking all this time out of my great anguish and distress. And then, as we know, Eli understands his mistake. He sends her home, and he promises her that God will grant her what she asked for, that is to say, a son. So the prayer of Hannah became a very paradigmatic prayer. It became a paradigmatic prayer because we actually talk about two prayers. This prayer is a prayer of supplication, of request. She asks God for the child. And the next chapter is a psalm of thanksgiving. And a lot of scholars debated if a simple woman could really compose this beautiful prayer. But it became a paradigmatic prayer of thanksgiving, and especially thanksgiving that has to do with women. Yeah. ותתפלל חנה ותאמר, עלץ ליבי באדוני, רמה כרמי באדוני. And Hannah prayed, my heart exalted in the Lord, in the eternal. I have triumphed through the eternal. I gloated over my enemies. I rejoice at your deliverance. And especially look at verse 5 that refers to her situation as a barren woman who conceived. Men once sated must hire out of bread. Men once hungry, hunger no more. While the barren woman bears 7, the mother of many is forlorn. Let's see what this prayer did in the history of the Jewish liturgy, but not only the liturgy. So we are very fortunate to be here with Professor Mark Brettler, who recently wrote about Psalm 113. This is the first psalm of the Hallel prayer that we sing on festivals. And he says that at least the second part of the psalm is based upon the song of Hannah in the book of Samuel that we just saw. And it constitutes maybe a prayer of a barren woman who is happy to conceive, happy to be able to bear a child. Now he compares these two texts, Psalm 113 and Samuel and 1 Samuel chapter 2. And he concludes that Samuel is older text, and the psalm is sort of tries to imitate an ancient language, archaic language, but it is based upon that. So if he's right, and we can't really prove it, but I think it's a very, very compelling idea. If he's right that a prayer that marked this moment in a woman's life was embedded in the liturgy without the reference to the original Sitzen Leben, the original existential context, it may tell us that there were other psalms that were composed to mark life cycle events of women that were not preserved or did not make it into the canon. And I think this is a very compelling way of thinking about it. So this is one offspring, if I may call it this way, of Hannah's prayer. Another offspring is in the Christian Bible. I don't like to call it the New Testament because for me there's one testament. Well, it's the Christian Bible in Luke chapter 1, and that's the Song of Mary, when Mary meets her cousin, and after she received the annunciation from Angel Gabriel that she's gonna have a child in a divine way. She formulates this prayer that is very similar in its content and also in its metaphors to the prayer of Hannah. And on the left side, you can see a picture that was taken from a church of visitation not so far away from here in Enkarim. And here you can see the text of the Song of Mary that is also called the Magnificat in many, many languages. And the Magnificat is an important part in the Christian liturgy. In the Catholic Church, it's part of the Vespers, in the daily evening prayer. It's also in the Anglican Church, and in other denominations, it is also used, the Song of Mary or the Magnificat. So here you see another offspring of the prayer of Hannah. So it became like a formula of prayer for women who conceived after waiting for a long time to have a child. That's what we saw in the Hebrew Bible in Psalm 113, if Mark Brettler is correct, and I hope he is. And we see that it is also a paradigm of prayer for in the Christian liturgy. That's what we saw in Luke. It became a paradigm of rules and regulations and halachot in the Jewish law. We will see it hopefully in the Talmud Bavli in Tractate Brachot. And it entered it has a place in the Jewish liturgy as it is read on Rosh Hashanah prayer on the first day. And if you want to see more about it, then Dr. Tova Hartman wrote about Hannah's unconventional prayer and her different voice that she makes and how it became prominent in the culture. So that's some things that I wanted to say about Hannah's prayer. I move on to the second chapter. You see, we do it relatively fast. And here I want to talk about women and prayer in the Second Temple period, that is to say, from the returning of the Jews from Babylon until the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 in Common Era. And here we can see that for the most part, I would say, the main worship of the Jews had to do with the offerings and things that have to do with the temple. We will get to the temple first, but let us see two examples that I find very interesting of literary characters of women who pray. And in the Second Temple literature, and this is interesting because it kind of gets lost after that in the rabbinic time. And we're going to have to ask ourselves, why is that we have so many very developed and interesting prayers of women in the Second Temple period, and then they kind of disappear in the Tanaitic and Amoraic period, that is to say, the classical rabbinic time. So the first example that I want to bring here is the prayer of Esther. Now, all of you know that the book of Esther, the scroll of Esther, presented a challenge to our ancestors. This is a very challenging book because on one hand, Esther and Mordecai, it doesn't happen in the land of Israel. The main characters don't want to go back to the land of Israel. We don't hear about their offsprings. Their names are not necessarily Jewish name. Well, Esther has a Jewish name, Hadassah, but she's called Esther, which rings a bell with Ishtar or Stara, that has pagan meaning in it. No prayers, no name. The name of God is not mentioned in the Megillah. After the Jews are saved from their persecution, no thanksgiving, nothing. No Jewish. It's not a very Jewish text between us, right? And above all that, Esther marries a foreign king, which is a big no-no. This is something that the whole massacre of Shechem happened because Dinah was taken by a non-Jew, and here she marries a foreign king. What are we going to do with that? And you know that there were discussions in the Talmud, in the rabbinic literature, whether the book of Esther should be included in the Hebrew Bible canon, yes or no. And one of my favorite midrashim is that Esther herself appears in the house of study and says to them, "Kvauni ledarot," please, I need to be in the canon. I want to be remembered for generations. Nevertheless, Esther, the book of Esther, is problematic in that sense. And Jews throughout the ages, in the means of the Targum, or the translated texts, in the means of the Midrash, in the means of other texts that were juxtaposed to the book of Esther, try to deal with this very problematic issue. So one of the most ancient ways of dealing with the problematic aspects of the book of Esther is what we see in the Greek translation of the scroll, the Septuaginta Targum HaShiv'im, and the translation that was done by Jews, probably Hellenistic Jews in Alexandria, probably, present a very different character of the book of Esther. First of all, the name of God is mentioned. Everybody is very pious. And you have minor additions and you have big additions. And two of the additions have to do with prayer. You have the prayer of Mordechai, which is relatively short and concise, and you have the prayer of Esther. And the prayer of Mordechai and Esther appear at the moment when the Jews find out, when Esther finds out about Haman's plan to destroy and to kill all the Jews. Let's see this prayer and read it. And I want to invite you to see if you can find within it, if there's something that is necessarily or essentially feminine in this text of prayer. Then Queen Esther, seized with deadly anxiety, fled to the Lord. She took off her splendid, you see, I prefer to use the word eternal when it comes to the ineffable name of God, because I think it's closer to the original meaning in Hebrew. But here I use the NRSV translation, so I'll follow their lead on that. So she fled to the Lord. She took off her splendid apparel and put on garments of distress and mourning. And instead of her costly perfume, she covered her hair with ashes and dung, and she utterly humbled her body. Every part that she loved to adorn, she covered with her tangled hair. Probably she had a very, very long hair. She prayed to the Lord of God of Israel and said, so you see, we don't just have the text of the prayer, we have the entire setting of the prayer. So she really puts herself in a low place. She takes away all the signs of her royalty, and she places herself in a very low position before the Eternal. And then she says, oh, I can't see that. Oh my Lord, you only are our King. Help me, who am alone and have no helper but you. So after addressing God, she just says it. She says what she needs. She says it right away. She doesn't go around the bush. She said, help me. I'm alone. I'm all alone. And so she starts with her own distress, and then she's going to, as you see, she's going to put it in the context or in the national context. For my danger is in my hand. Ever since I was born, I have heard in the tribe of my family that you, O Lord, took Israel out of the nations and our ancestors from among all their forebears for an everlasting inheritance, and that you did for them all that you promised. So right away she says, I'm not expecting you, God, to do something that you don't do. It's all under your job description. All I want you to do is just be what you can be. Help me just the way you helped my ancestors. So you see, she puts her prayer in the larger context of the generation, of the prayer of generation. And now she starts with a confession. And now we have sinned before you, and you have handed us to our enemies because we glorified their gods. You are righteous, O God, or Lord. O Lord, do not surrender your scepter to that that has no being. Wait a second. And do not let them laugh at my downfall, but turn their plan against them and make an example of him who began this against us. Remember what she said, what she does here. Look at the last verse, verse 7. It's very much the essence of the vidui, of the penitential prayer. Lecha Adonai tzedakah velanu boshet hapanim. To you, O Lord, the eternal, is the righteousness, and we are just shameful being. Yeah. So she abases herself. She acknowledges her sins, and from this low place she asks for help. And then she says, remember, O Lord, make yourself known in this time of our affliction, and give me courage, O Lord, O King of gods and Master of all dominion. Put eloquent speech in my mouth before the lion, and turn his heart to hate the man who is fighting against us, so that there may be an end of him and those who agree with him. So you can see that what she's doing here is she's praying. She starts with herself, then she gives the context of the Jewish history, and then she places her task within the task of saving her people. And that's the last part of the prayer. I skipped a few verses, but this is the main phrases here. But save us by your hand and help me, who am alone and have no helper but you, O Lord. I abhor. Now she gives us, yes, she talks with God, but she's really talking with us, the readers, who maybe wondered, what a nice Jewish girl does in the palace of the foreign king. Now she's going to give us an explanation what's going on there. I abhor the sign of my proud position, which is upon my head, my crown, on days when I appear in public. I abhor it like a filthy rag. I think it's some of the translation talks about menstruational rag, really something that is defiled. And I do not wear it on days when I am at leisure. What are the days when I am at leisure? She keeps the Shabbat probably, right? She's a very, very religious, nice Jewish girl. And your servant has not eaten at Haman's table. I keep kosher. I have not honored the king's feast or drunk wine of libation. I don't drink yei nesech. I don't drink foreign wine. Yeah. Your servant had no joy since the day that I was brought here until now, except in you, O Lord God of Abraham. So I don't enjoy this whole situation. Don't think that this is something that I enjoy doing. I do it because I have to do it. Yeah, I have a task here. I have a role here. And then she concludes her prayer saying, oops, I guess I was muted. Okay, I hope you hear me, because it looks as if I'm muted. Oh God, whose might is all over, hear the voice of the despairing and save us from the hands of the evildoer and save me from my fear. So it's not just the national task here, it's also save me from my fear, because I'm in such a terrible distress. So that's the first woman that I wanted to bring here, how the Targum, the Greek translation of the Bible, sort of converted Esther into being a very, very religious and pious and modest woman. Another way of dealing, or another text that deals with the difficulties that you can find in the scroll of Esther is the book of Judith, that some scholars believe that was composed to answer specifically these questions. Because if you juxtapose Judith and Esther, now I'm talking about Esther in our Megillah, in our book of Esther, not in the translation. If you juxtapose between them, you see that Judith is very different. First of all, Judith, look at her name. Her name, what can be more Jewish than Judith? Yeah, and she lives in Butulia. What is Butulia? No, not in Shushan back there, enjoying on the rivers of the Hudson Valley, or the Hudson River, or the Babylonian, the Persian luxuries. She lives in Judea, in Butulia, which is, Butulia could be a corruption of the name Beit El, or something that has to do with Betula, that is to say a virgin. Judith is, the story of Judith, which I'm going to tell in a very, very short way. She's a widow, a rich and beautiful and pious widow that stays at home after her husband passed away, and she doesn't go out. But then she realizes that the leaders of the people are going to surrender to the invader, who's called Holofernes. This is a very anachronistic names, because it seems like he's the Ramatkal, the chief of staff, the head of the army of the Babylonian king, which is definitely not the case. The text of Judith is probably from the Hasmonate period, and the story is probably not an historic one, but it is a legend, a fantasy maybe of a victory, a military victory. So she decides to take things into her hand and go to the camp of the enemy and sort of seduce the local king and then the local leader Holofernes and then kill him, which she does. She comes back to her camp, to her city with his head, and that's a trope that is you can see a lot in art depictions. And the Jews won, and they prevailed over their enemies. Now, the book of Judith, unlike the scroll of Esther, our scroll of Esther, is filled with prayer. People are praying all the time. People are very, very pious and very religious. And let me just bring you here the prayer of Judith before she launches her journey into the camp of the enemy. Yes. By the way, she appears only on chapter 8 of the book. Okay, so here we have the book of Judith, and this is chapter 9. Then Judith prostrated herself, put ashes on her head, and uncovered the sackcloth that she was wearing. By the way, you see the setting of the prayer, not just the text, but how she deals with her body, what she does with her clothing before she prepares herself to pray. And look at the very interesting mark that we have here. When exactly was this prayer? When did it take place? At the very time when the evening incense, the Ktoret, was being offered at the house of the God in Jerusalem, Judith cried out to the Lord with a loud voice and said, now we're going to have the text of the prayer, but you see that she synchronized her prayer with the time of the incense offering in the temple of Jerusalem. So you can see I think it's a very interesting way of combining the prayer, the individual prayer, the prayer of this spectacular individual with the normal protocol of prayer, of worship, of liturgy that you find in the temple of Jerusalem. Let's see what she was saying. O Lord, God of my ancestor Simeon. Oh, my ancestor Simeon. That cannot be just a statement. She sees herself as a descendant of Shimon, the son of Jacob, who, in a way, well, according to what she says here, protected the honor of Dinah when he committed the massacre with his brother Levi in the people of Shechem after Dinah was raped / taken or went with the son of the leader of the city. So by mentioning her ancestor as Shimon, we know where it is going to. Protect my honor, protect my sexual honor in a way. So, O Lord God of my ancestor Shimon, to whom you gave sword to take revenge of those strangers who had torn off the virgin clothing and defiled her. Of course, she's talking about Dinah, as we said, and exposed her thighs to put her in shame, and polluted her womb to disgrace her. For you said, it shall not be done. Yeah, you said. So I'm not asking of anything that is not within the protocol of what we can expect from you, God. You gave up their rulers to be killed. Oh God, my God, hear me also, a widow, right? She calls herself a widow. I'm in a very low place. I'm one of the low or weak segments of society, although she was a very fine and rich widow, but this is how she chooses to present herself. Oh, it's on my text here. Okay. For your strength does not depend on numbers, nor your might on powerful. But you are the God of the lowly, helper of the oppressed, upholders of the weak, protectors of the forsaken, savior of those without hope. Please, please, God of my father, God of the heritage of Israel, Lord of heaven and earth, creators of the waters, King of all your creation, hear my prayer. And indeed, I cited a little bit more. Make my deceitful words being, it covers my text all the time. Bring wound and bruise on those who have planned cruel things against your covenant. Yeah, this is what we call it tzorech gavoa. Don't protect me. I'm okay. I can be killed. I can be defiled. That's fine with me. But do it for your sake, for your covenant. Yeah. And against your sacred house, and against Mount Zion, and against your house, your children, the house your children possess. Let your whole nation and every tribe know and understand that you are God, and the God of all power and might, and that there is no other who protects the people of Israel but you alone. I had to capitalize a few words here. I'm sorry about that. So here we have two prayers of individuals, but both of them are prayers that are put in literary characters, right? They're not a protocol. They're not a citation of real women. Now let us see, and we don't have much time. We only have 12 minutes left. So I'm going to try to be as quick as I can to talk a little bit about the temple in Jerusalem. And this is going to be a segue between the Second Temple time and the rabbinic time, because the temple was there, of course, until the destruction in years 70. But the texts that we have are from the rabbinic time. So we don't always know if what the rabbis are telling us about the temple. And sometimes we have conflicting messages, especially when it comes to women and prayer. And what was the role of women in the temple, and how far women could get into the temple, and what could they do? We don't really know. We know what the rabbis wrote. So is it a historical depiction of what was in the temple? Maybe. Is it how the rabbis envisioned or even imagined what happened in the temple? Could be. But nevertheless, it is, I think, interesting. I will just mention that some of the rabbinic texts that we have about the temple are relatively considered to be relatively old, and some of them may really represent the situation as it was in the temple. So first of all, let me share with you the picture of the temple, of the Second Temple, the Herod Temple, and you can see that the outer court, it's built like matrushka or babushka, when you go, the further you go, the more sacred the place is, and we will see that in a second. The women's court was basically the place where everybody was. Yeah, it wasn't like what we have today that only women are in Ezrat Nashim. Ezrat Nashim was the place where everybody could was present, right? Priests and Israelites, men and women. You see at the four corners the chambers of wood, the chamber of the Nazarites, the chamber of oil, the chamber of the lepers. This is where major public events took place. So every 7 years when you have Hakel, the assembly, this is where the king stood and read from the Torah. And on Yom Kippurim, the high priest, after completing the special ritual, this is where he would read from the Torah to the people. This is where the Simchat Bet HaShoeva, the rejoicing over a libation of water, took place. So basically, Ezrat Anashim, the women's court or courtyard or gallery, or however you want to translate it, was the place where men and women could be together. And this is very important for me to stress, because sometimes when we talk about men and women praying together, and in this with us today, we have some people that I have the fortune to pray in these days of our COVID-19 situation. We have a praying group We pray 3 times a day together. People from all the streams of Judaism, which is a very, very beautiful thing. Men and women, this is halachic, traditional prayer, but also egalitarian. Maybe we'll get to it in the last part that we have. But sometimes people say to me, but there was always Ezrat Nashim, there was always women's court, even in the Talmud. Well, the answer is no. In the Talmud, Ezrat Nashim was meant for men and women together. In fact, the first time that we see separate spaces of prayer for women are in the high Middle Ages, the beginning of the 2nd millennium, not before that. So how do you interpret it? That's a different thing. Did women enter the synagogue and were with men? Were they sitting together separately? Did women not even go to the synagogue? You know, one time a Lubavitcher rabbi said to me, this is very clear. You didn't need to have a women's gallery because women didn't go to the shul. But again, this is what we have in front of us, and it's up to us to evaluate how we understand these traditions. So let's see what the rabbis had to say about the women's gallery. First of all, this is what this is a citation from Mishnah Kelim, the first chapter of Mishnah Kelim, and it says, Eser Kedushotem. There are 10 levels or 10 degrees of holiness. Actually, if you count it well, it's not 10, but 11. Here I highlighted them for you. And it starts from the lesser holy place. Yeah, the land of Israel is holier than all lands, and they're walled cities, and then within cities, and then the Temple Mount, etc., until we reach the holiest place in the temple and in the entire world, the place from which, according to the Jewish tradition, the entire world was established, and that's the Holy of Holies. And you can see that the further you enter the holiness, less people can enter, and in very specific situations. So everybody can enter the land of Israel, of course, right? But only one person can enter the Holy of Holies, and in only one occasion, right? And if you see the line before the last, the Holy of Holies is still holier, for none may enter therein, save only the high priest, and only on the Day of Atonement at the time of the service. Now, the interesting thing that you have is that you have all kinds of categories, and this is a very exclusive list. Until what point really can non-Jews enter? Until what point can people who are ritually impure can enter? Until what point can Israelites enter? Or priests that are with some sort of blemish, or priests that are, or the high priest. The one category that is missing here, and I would not assume that it is a mistake or someone just forgot to write it, is the category of gender. In no place in this list does it say how further women can enter the temple. What does it say to us? I don't know. Again, it is upon us to try to make sense of it all. I move to Tractate Sukkah, and then it says, B'motza'ei Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag, at the conclusion of the first day of the festival of Sukkot, they descended to the women's court, and they would make a tikkun gadol, a great enactment. Now, the Mishnah doesn't tell us what the great enactment was, but apparently, and here you see the what used to be the Holy Land, now it's in the Israel Museum, make of the ancient Jerusalem in the Herod's time. What is this tikkun gadol? What is this great enactment? The Mishnah doesn't tell us here, but in a different place in the Mishnah, in Tractate Midot, it speaks about the women's court, and it says originally it, that is to say the women's court, has been bare, but subsequently they surrounded it with balcony so that women could behold from above while men from below, so they don't become mixed. Now, if I take these two traditions together, which is not necessarily a kosher thing, but maybe, I learned that every year in the first day of Sukkot, they did this great enactment. They separated between men and women. They did this tikkun gadol. So if they did this tikkun gadol every Sukkot, and for the festival of Sukkot, because of the frivolous and lightheadedness maybe of, or the kalut rosh, no, you don't say lightheadedness, you say not very serious, maybe some alcohol going on and festivities. On this festival, they didn't want men and women to be together. So they separated them. So what does it tell me about the rest of the year? I think it tells me that the rest of the year, men and women were not separated. They were only separated in the festival of Sukkot, which in a different place, the rabbis call skaba de shata. This is the wound of the year. This is the soaring place of the year, because people are so happy and they do all kinds of things, and you can't really manage the situation. That's why you need to separate the genders. In the Talmud Bavli, in Tractate Sukkot, it tells us the following. It says, Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught, originally the women were within, that is to say within the temple court, while the men were without. But this caused lightheadedness. It caused, I don't know if lightheadedness is a good translation. It caused the light attitude, if it were. So they instituted that women sit without, while the men sit within. As this, however, they still led to lightheadedness. This is still, encounters between men and women that were not desired. So they instituted that women should sit above on the balconies and men below. So you can see here 3 stages of separation between men and women. The first one was women were inside and the men were outside, or on the outer skirts of the women's court. And then they reversed it. It didn't help. And then they separated between men and women in terms of the levels. Right? Women had to sit above. What does it teach you? You can learn from it all kinds of things. You can learn from it a very hopeful voice and a very distressing voice. I choose to take a hopeful lesson from it, saying that it was important for them that women would be part of the celebration. Now, if you cannot have men and women together, you need to separate them, fine. But there's still importance that women will be together with men. I see that we kind of run out of time. I just want to mention when we get to the 3rd chapter, women in prayer in the classical rabbinic time, that is to say the Tanaitic and the Amoraic times, the sages of the times of the Mishnah and the times of the Talmudim. Here we will see something that is very, very strange, because we all talk about, I remember, my BA years and all my professors used to talk about the great democratic revolutions of Chazal, of the rabbis. What a precious gift we brought to the world. Now you don't need a priest to perform the rituals for you. Every Jew can stand and lead a prayer. Every Jew can be counted in a minyan. Right, every Jew, if he's male, right? So in a way, and this is something that I find very intriguing, the very exclusive situation of the temple was more egalitarian toward women, because everybody was excluded. The priests ran the show. Of course, men could lay their hands on the korban, on the offerings. People could slaughter, and you have discussions if women are allowed or not allowed to do so. But basically, it was the priests' show, the Kohanim's show. Now, after the destruction of the temple, where everyone can basically lead a prayer, that puts women aside. Yeah, and now you really have a marginalization of women. And we will gonna have to really look well to find in the rabbinic literature the threads that will tell us something about the world of prayer of women in that era. So interestingly enough, the world doesn't always progress ahead. It doesn't always go to a better place. Sometimes we go even backwards a little bit. So just to summarize what we just said until now, I mentioned that we're going to have to talk about several things simultaneously. We're going to talk about women as prayers. We're going to talk about prayers composed by women. or put in the mouth of women or composed for women, which will be a very important part for us next week when we're going to talk about the tchines, the prayer in the vernacular that were composed, some of them by women and some of them for women. And we will see how those who composed them for women wanted to create this perfect Jewish woman through the words of prayer. And then we can talk about prayers mentioning women. For example, the prayer, the blessing to Boaz, mentioning Rachel veLeah, Rachel and Leah, and then feminine prayers. We're going to have to ask ourselves, is the prayer of Judith, is the prayer of Esther in the Greek translation, are there necessarily, is there something essentially Jewish in them? I don't know. We're going to have to ask ourselves.